It's the week ending Saturday, the 23rd of January, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Joe Biden sworn in as the 46th US president, the suspension of all travel corridors into the UK, and the death of legendary record producer and convicted murderer Phil Spector at the age of 81. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Kari Wilkin, from the Week magazine, editor Theo Tait, and we welcome back freelance journalist Kieran Yates. Kari, you're starting this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are we ready to pay the price for slavery on our doorsteps?
Today I can announce a range of new measures to send a clear message that these violations of human rights are unacceptable, and at the same time to safeguard UK businesses and public bodies from any involvement or links with them.
Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab speaking in the House of Commons on Tuesday. Kari, what's the story?
So the government are just announcing that UK firms are going to face fines and potentially be barred from public sector procurement unless they can prove that their supply chains are free from forced labour. And this is in response to human rights abuses in China, where hundreds of thousands of Uyghur Muslims are being held in forced labour camps. And International Trade Secretary Liz Truss subsequently wrote an article that was published in The Telegraph in which she promised we will not turn a blind eye to modern slavery and set out a raft of new measures that the government is proposing to try and end this abuse of people.
And some of that comes a little bit closer to home, doesn't it, than Xinjiang? But let's just talk about China for a second, because we've seen a lot of journalism on this subject, actually, haven't we? We're talking about underexposed stories. People have talked about it.
Well, we've just had the US accusing China of genocide. So, yeah, it's the whole situation is revving up very quickly.
But why do you think it's taken so long for something of this magnitude to be said in Parliament?
I mean, there have been studies that have proven the extent. We're getting new evidence coming out of China all the time about this genocide, as we hear, of Uyghur Muslims. So there's increasing pressure, and obviously with Biden coming in as well, there's increasing pressure from the US to actually tackle this problem. His team have already started calling on the EU to address the problem after the EU and China recently signed a trade deal. So it's very much in the spotlight, and campaigners are increasingly saying that, look, we all need to take action about this. Having read Liz Truss's article in The Telegraph, I'm still not entirely clear about what it is the government is proposing. It's full of lovely sound bites, but very light on detail, as critics have pointed out.
Theo, are you any clearer?
Yeah, I think it's a series of add-ons to the 2015 Modern Slavery Act. And they are things like they will be offering robust guidance on who you can deal with and who you can't, and also that at the moment, most companies are meant to put out a modern slavery statement every year, but they don't necessarily, and there aren't really any sanctions for doing that. But now they will get a fine or something. But it's not strong stuff, I don't think.
Yeah, well, okay, so getting a fine or something, let's assume that is the ultimate punishment for companies that are doing this kind of thing, Kieran, continuing to use, for example, cotton that's been sourced from areas in Xinjiang which are accused of genocide. Bluntly, for some businesses, paying the fine will be the cheaper option, won't they? If they want to carry on sourcing from China, they just will, won't they?
Well, absolutely. And that's why when it comes to labour practice, bodies like the TUC have been advocating for greater supply chain transparency for years, since the 2015 Slavery Act. And I think that there's a reason for that, because they're saying we need to put the onus on companies to be more transparent, to review your standards annually, but also just to be more engaged with your workers, full stop. Not to put the onus on individual workers, but we should be looking at how to risk assess more effectively. We should have more due diligence in our workplaces. This sort of idea that this kind of transparency must only be happening at the top and it's just for, sort of large companies to deal with, I think is probably not the full picture. We need to really have this kind of trickle down conversations about things to be aware of and how we can be better vigilant in our day-to-day workspaces.
Global logistical supply chains, though, Kari, are, you might say deliberately opaque so that companies in Britain can rub their hands of having to deal with it. But genuinely, they are opaque. Like, it is hard to know, isn't it, sometimes, where your stuff's coming from. And is that the fault of businesses operating in Britain or in the EU?
I think the onus is on all of us, consumers, businesses, governments. The UK, for example, we led the way against this back in 2015 with the Modern Slavery Act. We were the first country in the world to require that businesses publish accounts of what they're actually doing to check that there's no slavery in their supply chains. As you say, that's a very difficult thing to do. But in the meantime, we have fallen behind. Human Rights Watch says that the UK, in tackling, this abuse in China, for example, Canada and the US prohibit goods produced wholly or in part by forced labour that have been proven to be. And campaigners are calling on the government to bring in mandatory human rights due diligence legislation rather than just these reporting requirements. So we can at least take that step.
But to what extent is this a problem with China generally? Whether or not our goods come from this particular region of China where we know this terrible thing's happening, Theo? I mean, the Foreign Secretary said the UK had a moral duty to respond. Some would say the moral thing to do, if it really is about ethics, is not to buy goods from China at all.
Yeah, I mean, that would mean quite a lot of goods not coming here anymore, wouldn't it? Everything would sort of fall apart.
And that was really the point I was making with my intro, in that consumers are going to have to pay more because we get our lovely cheap cotton, for example, from China. And if we are going to cut off those trade ties, we're all going to have to pay more. And also, we've got so many economic ties across the board with China. This is a financial sacrifice that we have to decide if we're willing to make.
But if you just take him at his word, that is the conclusion, whether or not it's problematic and difficult to do.
Yeah, I mean, realistically, something more than 80% of Chinese cotton comes from Xinjiang. And so there is a big question mark over most Chinese cotton. If we were being really ethical, we would say no more Chinese cotton, wouldn't we? The
problem is that this is a huge global problem. This isn't just China. There are an estimated 40 million people across the world who were victims of modern slavery. That's 5.4 in every 1,000 people.
OK, and I did mention that you wanted to highlight a story closer to home on this as well. So go for it. This concerns the recycling firm Biffa, right?
Yeah, while the UK is pointing the finger at China about, these abuses, this is actually a major problem in the UK as well. In 2019, 10,000 potential victims of modern slavery were referred to the authorities, and campaigners say actually the true figure could be far higher, maybe 10 times higher. And in fact, this has been put back into the news again this week because 3 victims of trafficking and modern slavery have basically notified the recycling firm Biffa and an employment agency called Smart Solutions that they're going to sue them for their roles in what's been described as the largest modern slavery ring ever uncovered in the UK.
And Kari, we can actually talk about the details of what happened to these people, because the people who are found guilty of creating this slavery ring have gone to prison. So what had they endured?
Well, this all began back in 2015 when the Midlands Police launched what's called Operation Fort, and they basically found that this gang had trafficked an estimated 400 people from Poland to work in the UK in farms, poultry farms, recycling centres like Biffa. And essentially these people are promised great things, amazing new life, lovely jobs when they come to England. But when they get here, their passports are taken. They're basically imprisoned in horrible, squalid conditions. They're sent out to work, but the gang set up the bank accounts in their name, but the actual victims can't access the cash. So they're essentially, working as slaves. And these 3 victims, it's 2 men and a woman, none of whom could speak English when they came here. They were subcontracted to Biffa in 2014 and 2015 to sort rubbish on a conveyor belt. And 8 members of the gang were jailed in 2019, which is great, obviously. But these claimants in the new case are sort of saying, but, what about the firms? They should have been monitoring their workforces too.
And so the suggestion, Kieran, is that if firms don't tighten up their procedures, this is obviously still happening under our noses.
I think there's something to be said about the ethical positions that we take. I mean, it's all well and good having these conversations about companies and a relationship with the UK under the Modern Slavery Act, but we also know that, our relationships with foreign bodies like the Qatar World Cup, following the big story about the Nepalese migrant workers who were dying under terrible conditions. I mean, FIFA basically imposed some relatively flimsy sanctions, which critics said, and then kept it moving. And we've had this kind of thing with sporting bodies and, the sort of Olympics committees previously when we've talked about the terrible working conditions and modern slavery. This is a conversation which isn't rooted to corporate companies and in their relationship with the UK.
Theo, do you think there is scope to feel sorry for the businesses caught up in this, though? I mean, in this particular case we're discussing, they were using a recruitment company, as Kari said. So they paid into the accounts they were told were the accounts of the people they were employing. The people who perpetrated the real crime, as I said, of bringing these people over to work as slaves, they're in prison. Is it really a company's responsibility to check out that everyone is who they say they are if they're being trafficked? Or is it the police's responsibility to put the traffickers in prison?
I don't know, honestly. I mean, I don't know about the facts of this one. I suppose you've got to set minimum requirements for due diligence with these things, and if they don't meet that, then they're culpable.
But you employ people, don't you, Theo? If you were, using a recruitment agency, wouldn't you trust the recruitment agency had done the necessary vetting? I mean, I appreciate anyone who's working at your magazine will speak English, you'd be able to ask them. But, in a menial job like this.
Yeah, I think you would. And, I think the danger is that then you can always say, oh, well, this was subcontracted out and this isn't my problem.
And also the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, Dame Sarah Thornton, she published a review last June saying, actually, there is more that companies can do. And we're talking the companies that were tied up in these, that have been linked to supply chains linked to forced labour. We're talking huge companies, all the major food chains, Asda, Tesco, Sainsbury's, M&S, Ocado, and a lot of DIY stores, in fact, B&Q, Homebase. The list goes on. But she actually gave a raft of recommendations that companies could use to try to stop this, and the government in return, having for all that we're seeing this stand being taken this week, the government criticised her report as excessively critical and decided not to implement any of the changes recommended. So there is more we could be doing. It's just a case of, are we going to?
Okay, Kieran, I'm coming to you next after this. Okay, Kieran, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this the week that Zoom quizzing took on new life?
Can you pay this, yes or no? I can't go with me now. I'm now going to take your car.
And their possessions.
Can't afford to pay the rent, but £700 telly.
We meet the people who are owed money.
Just got taken advantage of, big time.
And the people whose job it is to collect it.
I don't want to touch that.
Don't panic.
Because when you can't pay, they'll take it away.
Who is still watching this stuff on daytime TV to feel better about themselves? There's an opening scene from Channel 5's Can't Pay, We'll Take It Away. Kieran, I'm interested to know why or what this story is.
Yeah, well, apologies for that hellish clip. So this is from a story that I've been looking at this week relating to bailiffs being able to enter homes to seize goods via Zoom, WhatsApp and FaceTime. So the details of this are basically that it's following a High Court order which recently states that you can have a controlled goods agreement and you don't need to be physically present for that. Now, very simply put, a controlled goods agreement is kind of your first port of call before your goods are seized. And so the High Court have asked the question, do bailiffs need to physically be in the presence of the goods in order to evaluate them? And they said no. So you can give a bailiff permission to view your property via a video call, and then the onus would be on you via the Zoom or on your phone to show your bailiff around your goods, which you've said, okay, we're going to set up a payment plan, and then they remotely would evaluate them and say, okay, you have this amount of time to pay, and then if not, we'll come physically to remove them.
Okay, I mean, maybe I've watched more Can't Pay, We'll Take It Away than I think I have. But from what I've seen, when someone is on the receipt of one of these calls from a bailiff, it's not just about evaluating their property, it's then about seizing the goods if they can't sign up to a payment plan, isn't it? So how do you seize someone's possessions when you're not actually there?
Well, that's right. This is the first port of call before that. So usually what happens is that bailiffs will physically come to give you a controlled goods agreement. And the High Court has said, actually, you don't need to do that. And it's an interesting story to me because on the face of it, it feels like a really intrusive story that, suddenly you have bailiffs on your phone talking to you and you are showing them around your house while everybody's there. But actually, this could be a pandemic solution that stays because yes, the real questions are how this is going to be enforced, but it does give tenants a longer repayment period. And it does mean that bailiffs aren't coming to your house twice.
Theo, doesn't it also just encourage people to either ignore the Zoom call or subterfuge when it happens? I mean, stick everything in their neighbour's garden and say, oh, look, I haven't got anything. I haven't got a telly. Yeah,
or refuse to go into some rooms or, hide. I don't know how the ins and outs of it and how they aim to make it a sort of a convincing process. It does sound sort of pretty dystopian, doesn't it? Someone coming into your house on your mobile phone, looking all around, being shown in, sort of Black Mirror type thing. But if it's saving you the £200 fee and it's a lot less intrusive than someone coming banging on your door, then maybe it's a good thing.
Yeah, it does save you that fee.
So just to be clear, that's a fee that currently, at the moment, people in debt are charged for the pleasure of having a bailiff come round and assess their goods. Is that right?
That's right.
Wow. Actually, but why? Because, I mean, there's the whole issue about why they might be charged in the first place, but there's still the cost of the bailiff's time, even if they're not at your property. It's not free to sit in an office and call someone on a video call, is it?
No, but I think, but the reason that this story is of particular interest is because it does have ramifications for how bailiff reform potentially could be. Now, of course, there's these obvious questions like how will they value the goods remotely? How are they going to get the information? Because what they do at the moment is they send you a letter. So do you then have to respond to the letter and give them your WhatsApp number? What about if you don't have internet? How are your vulnerabilities going to be identified remotely? There's lots of questions.
Forgive me for asking the obvious questions, Kieran.
But what bailiff reform organisations are saying, well, this is a perfect moment then to talk about the need to create independent bailiff regulators. If we're going to use these innovations, how do we make sure that they don't just perpetuate the worst of the industry? And how can we make sure that these well-intentioned innovations don't actually end up harming vulnerable tenants even further? So bailiff reform organisations like Taking Control are saying this is a time for reform and this could really be a pandemic solution that we could move forward with.
I do also wonder, Kari, whether it's just a slightly more laid-back intrusion into your home to have someone on a video call, and that therefore actually not having the adrenaline pumping through your veins. I mean, that's why this gets shown on daytime TV, isn't it? People get stressed, weird things happen. Not having the adrenaline pumping through your veins, not panicking, actually having a calm conversation about how you are going to pay your debts in however many installments over however many months. This might actually lead to a better outcome for everybody.
I think this is a very good thing, actually. I mean, my initial gut reaction was, as Theo was saying, that it's very dystopian and you don't want people being able to come into your house remotely or in any way. But actually, the move's been welcomed by groups including Citizens Advice and the government's all-party parliamentary group for debt and personal finance as a better way of managing debt. And as you say, it takes that stress, it takes that embarrassment and the confrontational aspects of it out. And the bailiff industry is largely self-regulated. So there was there have been some abuses going on. As Taking Control, this company that Kieran mentioned, has been talking about. At the moment, bailiff enforcement of rental evictions has been suspended during the pandemic, and they're asking all visits to be suspended during lockdowns for any kind of debt enforcement, because obviously it's putting everyone at danger. They're saying that to have doorstep visits at this point is unconscionable. And and just to remove that stress, and yes, it's definitely a solution during the pandemic, but also it could definitely go forward and just be a much more sort of civilized way of doing it.
Again, though, I really have watched more of these programs than I think I have. As often, I seem to recall, Theo, that people will go and ask their neighbour for some cash to pay these guys to get them to go away. Like, you kind of scrabble around trying to get as much money as you can. I suppose that option's gone if it's all digital, isn't it?
If it's just to collate your list of your possessions, then they presumably wouldn't be doing that.
But, well, Kieran, do you think it is just that? Do you think it will always be followed up by an in-person visit?
Yes, I think so. And this is a slightly different issue to the bailiffs enforced evictions, which are currently happening. I mean, there has been a brief suspension by Robert Jenrick, who suspended bailiffs enforced evictions from January the 8th to the 21st of February, although Scotland and Welsh government have extended their suspensions to the 31st of March. But the point is that bailiffs are still doing in-person visits, and the government regulations at the moment are still quite surprising. When you look online, the regulations are that you should wear PPE, don't raise your voice too much because you're shouting and that, increases transmission. You're still able to seize goods and cars. So this is one port of call, the Controlled Goods Agreement, which helps tenants be slightly safer. But it doesn't mean that bailiffs are not still entering homes. And it doesn't mean that bailiffs will not continue to be entering homes, because as we know, this is something that's just going to continue. The data from Shelter from earlier this year said that 42% of renters, which is 1.9 million households in Britain, are seeking support for housing costs. And that's a 36% increase from February last year. So the reality is that this is going to be an ongoing issue moving forward in Britain and in British life. And now is the time that it makes sense to not only suspend bailiff activity in the short term, but in the long term, really look at reform.
And is that the reason, Kieran, why this is your story of the week? Because if you're in the fortunate position like me, or most of us, I suspect, of not really worrying imminently that the bailiffs are going to pop round, we tend to look at what are the implications for everybody else. I suppose the implications for everybody else are you could be in that group sooner than you realise.
Yeah, exactly. These things are increasingly precarious. And as we look at the conversations that are coming out of housing activists, but also from our government, the message is that we are in a precarious housing market. And so there's a kind of bunch of stories that are talking about how, everybody's buying and selling their house at the moment. But the reality is that British homeowners are struggling, British renters are struggling. Social housing is a very flawed system that is rendering people even more vulnerable. And bailiffs are becoming more and more a part of everyday life, and so it really benefits us to advocate for reform.
Yeah, and going to that point, if you've got a mortgage, you can ask for a mortgage holiday, you can have an official mortgage holiday. If you're a renter, you're stuffed, aren't you? And more recent figures from Citizens Advice actually found that 500,000 private tenants are behind with rent by an average of more than 700,000, but yet 58% of those who were behind on rent had no rent arrears in February. So this debt problem has definitely been fueled by the pandemic, obviously. And what's going to happen? That debt isn't going to go away when the pandemic ends. So what's the solution? You don't want bailiffs storming in to desperate families.
Yeah, obviously when the furlough finishes, there's going to be an absolute explosion of people with serious debt problems. So I suppose the more we concentrate on this now, the better.
OK, Theo, you're up next after this. OK, Theo, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
I think it was the week when we learned that there's a slight tension between opening a new coal mine and heading for net zero emissions.
The coking coal, which is used in industrial processes, is a different issue. And there was a debate, I can be frank about that, there was a debate in the government about what we could do about this. But as you will know, Mr. Jones, this was a local decision. This was a local planning decision. And the argument, I think, is a fair one, which says that we have steel processes, we have industrial processes which use coking coal. And if we don't have sources of coking coal in the UK, we would be importing those anyway.
Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng there speaking to BBC News on Tuesday. And Theo, it was as part of that interview that he used that phrase you just referred to there, a slight tension, about the fact that a new Cumbrian coal mine has been approved. Talk us through it.
Yeah, it was Woodhouse Colliery near Whitehaven. It's going to be the first new deep coal mine in the UK since 1987. And as he was mentioning there, it's going to be producing coking coal, which is for steel production, rather than thermal coal. But it will produce a very large amount of it. So it's going to produce nearly 3 million tonnes of coal per year. Existing coal production in the UK is about 4 million tonnes. It was given the green light last year, but more recently Robert Jenrick, the Minister of State for Housing, said he would not call in the council's decision, which is when you can intervene and stop it. So basically it's passed its last major hurdle.
And the tension arises from the fact that, as we've seen in the news just this week, Boris Johnson's celebrating Joe Biden's commitment to climate change reduction. We're supposed to be leading the world on doing things like not building coal mines. Exactly.
For about 30 years, it's going to produce enough coal to generate 8.4 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent every year. And we have the legally binding target to reach net zero emissions by 2050. But as part of the planning system, it's agreed to close it down in 2049, which seems particularly...
Cutting it fine, I think is what it's called.
Exactly. Cutting it fine, yeah.
So what does that mean for the people that have invested in it then? Is there really money to be made out of an investment is going to end in 2049?
Well, it's got 30 years, so I assume they've looked at the numbers.
Yeah, but okay, yes, it's got 30 years, but it's still, considering there's so much backlash, it seems like a strange choice to invest in. There's obviously more money. I suppose what I'm getting at is there's probably more money in this kind of traditional mining than perhaps we're led to think.
Yeah, I think it is a big market, and in Europe there are no producers of this kind of outside of Russia. But I guess maybe they're thinking that later on they might be able to extend it.
Well, okay, so on that point, Kari, that there are no producers outside of Russia of the kind of coal that you need to make steel, people say, therefore, that if we're going to have steel, we have to import the coal to make steel or import the steel. So actually, it's not entirely unenvironmental to make it yourself.
Yeah, that was what the government, one of the grounds on which this coal mine got approved. The government ministers argued that basically if we're going to have to ship it in anyway, and it's not just Russia actually, it's from the US, Canada, Russia and Australia, and the UK and European steelmaking plants currently import around 60 million tonnes of this coal every year. So their argument was, well, you're going to get emissions either way, whether it's transport or doing it yourself. So, but that seems like a slightly flawed argument when at the same time the Climate Change Committee is saying that all coal, including coking coal, should be phased up by 2035. Surely it's better to be focusing on that target rather than doing this, particularly when the UK is gearing up to host the UN Climate Summit in November, which is going to be a huge deal. So we're going to be urging other nations to phase out fossil fuels at the same time as going, yeah, but it's cheaper for us to import it, so we'll just keep doing it and worry about that bit later.
But Kieran, an ambitious target is all very well, but actually if you're talking about phasing out coking coal, then you're talking about phasing out steel, as I understand it. That is unrealistic, isn't it, in the next 15 years?
I think it's unrealistic to assume that you can continue in this way without some kind of sort of either devastating backlash in the polls or otherwise. I mean, we know that this seems really at odds with the mood of the country, and particularly the mood of the young country. Last January, 70% of British 18 to 24-year-olds said they worried about climate change more than a year ago. So this is something that is just going to continue, and presumably we're only going to see more action around it. But it's, stories like this are also, it feels anachronistic because so much of the news and reporting and cultural commentary and political commentary is about connection, is about allowing us to see these decisions in a global context. So this isn't just a Cumbria story. This is about the European Green New Deal. It is about our net emissions targets. It is about, I think Duncan Jones said that it was difficult to persuade Poland to abandon coal when building a mine over here. And it's true. This has a knock-on effect to all of our international discussions. And I think that it feels like this is not a healthy way to go, or even a sensible way to go, really, if you want to engage in those kinds of conversations in a real intelligent way.
I mean, it may be a global story, Theo, but I mean, the mine was approved by the Cumbrian County Council on the basis of it creating jobs in that area, an area with high unemployment. I mean, whether or not that is justification, does it show, I don't know, a failure of a lack of imagination that they could look to other industries to try and revive that area, or a failure of government support to support places like Cumbria to wean themselves off industries like this?
Well, I think if I was Cumbria County Council and you had this thing in front of you, which is, lots of people saying, well, they should be investing in the green economy instead, but there's an actual solid, concrete project in front of you, and it's going to give you 500 really good jobs, apprenticeships. This is an area with seriously deprived area which has a heritage of mining. So I can see that it's very, very tempting as an offer.
To state the obvious, it's short-term thinking, isn't it? Basically, you've got it in front of you, you can please the voters now. And actually, there have been sources have suggested to the BBC that the government gave this pit the go-ahead to secure, so-called red wall votes in areas that previously voted Labour. They're just looking at the short term of, we need to stay in power to make these changes. So this is what a sacrifice we've got to make. But whether it's actually going to end up costing them a lot more in the long term is a very good question.
But it is, they have their levelling up agenda. Jobs in the north are a very important part of it. The local MP is a recently elected Tory, a red wall Tory, as you say. I can see why they didn't want to get involved. And it is true that, even the wind farm industry uses a lot of steel. We're going to carry on using steel. So there are good reasons for wanting to keep it going. But I think what it does suggest that the government at a wider level is not doing much joined up thinking, since it has set up, in August 2019, it set up a clean steel fund to try and encourage people to make steel using less carbon emissions. And it does suggest that they're not sort of thinking through the entire thing if they're not intervening in projects like this.
Does it actually fairly attract the accusation that the government is being hypocritical? Or is there a defence position beyond jobs and short-term thinking, which is, I don't know, look, it's just one mine. It's one mine, but our general policy is this.
I mean, it is one mine, but if you look at the amount that it's going to produce, I mean, I know that the way that emissions are judged is not like this, but if you take the coke that's going to come out of it and you get the emissions, it's going to be more than doubling Cumbria's emissions per year. And that just doesn't seem like a good way to be going if we are trying to do this radical rethinking.
I think on a larger scale, it also undermines our status as, we're preaching to the world, come to Britain in November and we'll all figure out a way to basically phase out fossil fuels. Oh, but by the way, it's going to make securing a deal that much harder.
And it does put us at odds with America, doesn't it, Kieran, as I mentioned earlier? One of Joe Biden's first acts on day one, just after the inauguration, pretty much as Lady Gaga had hung up her microphone, was to go into the Oval Office and cancel the building of the Keystone XL pipeline.
Absolutely. And these are popular policies, that chimes with the mood of a lot of the progressive conversations happening in terms of radical rethinking energy and the Green New Deal in America. And this is something that, again, as Kari says, this is something that the UK government are saying that we're in support of. We're saying, we also share these values. And I think it's very difficult to build these relationships with what you're saying and what you're doing. And also, I can't help but feel like this is quite unfair to just say, look, this is a local decision, and we have to, support what locals want, because actually this is a government decision. This has to come with discussion and resource and really holistic discussion about what we're going to do, as opposed to saying, well, that's what they want, still's not going anywhere, let's go for it. I don't think that's good enough, really. You've
been looking at that pipeline decision as well, haven't you, Theo? I mean, Kieran says that it's radical and, progressive, but she also said it's popular. Is it popular with everyone? I mean, America's pretty polarised. I imagine it's not popular with those who do business with Canada.
Yeah, I mean, apparently 1,000 jobs are going to be lost. And yeah, it's a massive project. And so it's going to be very difficult. I mean, I would think that a lot of people involved close up to it would have been voting Trump almost on that issue alone. So, it is difficult.
And Kari, Greta Thunberg has commented saying that the UK's pledge to meet net zero carbon emissions by 2050, quote, basically means nothing. Do you think with a decision like this, it is actually possible for us to have net zero carbon emissions by 2050?
I mean, this is one isolated decision. So, as Theo says, it is going to produce a lot of carbon. But if it were an isolated instance, then possibly. I mean, we're still way off track. We have, when the business secretary who had in that clip at the beginning, Kwasi Kwarteng, he actually pointed out when he was defending the government's decision that the UK is on track with ceasing use of coal to generate electricity by 2025. But he also admitted that or tactically admitted that we're really not on target for the 2050 goals. So it's certainly not going to help.
Theo, a final thought?
Well, I suppose it does just make you think, doesn't it, that these, as Greta Thunberg was saying, that to have something which is A, legally binding, but B, going up till 2050 is, in practical terms, pretty meaningless, isn't it? But all I can say is I think it would be a difficult decision to make, and if I was Cumbria County Council, I would probably be quite tempted to not go the Green Way on this one.
And that is it for this week. My thanks to our very own man of steel, Theo Tait, and also to our data miners, Kari Wilkin and Kieran Yates, for digging deep into today's stories. Remember, you can subscribe to this show for free with no increase to your carbon footprint. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producers Sophie King and Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.